Erik Landfried. Welcome to the Buddy Ruski Show.
Thanks for having me.
Erik and I work together at Bike Durham. Some of you know I've been on the board of Bike Durham for about a year now, working on some fun transit projects. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later, but I really wanted to just spend some time getting to know Erik more. Erik has been around Durham for a little while now, worked at Go Triangle for over a decade, so he is a wealth of knowledge for all things transit. He's also a big Boston sports fan. Maybe that'll leak out during the conversation as well. But thanks again, Erik, for being on the show. Excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, of course. I'm excited too.
So in our pre-show call, you talked a little bit about growing up in the Northeast in the Boston area and quickly finding this affinity for maps and traveling and navigating and sort of just, finding your way through the world. And that has ultimately led to some professional decisions. But really, I'd love to hear more about how you found that affection for just like for traveling and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it started with the love of maps. You mentioned that earlier. I don't really know how that got started. My parents had one of those big National Geographic atlases, and for some reason I was just drawn to it. I really liked looking up different countries or states or cities. I liked drawing maps, based on what I was seeing in the atlas. I would even do it in the car on car rides. I'd just grab a piece of paper. I think my mom still has a map that I drew. I think I was 5 at the time, and it's of the United States, and it's got all the states, all the capitals. There are some large lakes in the western part of the United States that don't actually exist. I think I got a little confused as I headed a little further west, but it's always just been an interest of mine. It's just something about the way my brain works, I guess, that was an interest. And so that led to being very interested in helping to navigate on trips. We would do some car rides to the Midwest, which is where both of my parents are from, down south to Florida and to Europe. And that was just something that I loved to do.
Was that interest spurred on at all by your parents? Were they involved in any industry that would garner that sort of interest in maps and navigation?
No, it wasn't really anything that they did for work. I think we did travel a decent amount, which was, I think, helped that along. We went to Europe when I was 8 and did a trip to England and France and Switzerland, and I have a lot of really fond memories of that trip. We also lived in a place where, very rarely needed to get around by car. This was a suburb just outside of Boston, and I think for people who live in North Carolina, their view of suburbs, the suburbs tend to be a lot newer, more car-oriented. But in the Boston area, a lot of the suburbs are still very walkable, bikeable, or you could take the bus, or there are sometimes even subway lines that connect out to the suburbs. So where we lived growing up allowed me to basically walk or bike to all of my schools that I went to. Most of the activities that I did, I could walk to. And then if I wanted to the town itself really didn't have much going on. And so if I wanted to get to, go to restaurants or go see movies or whatever it is I wanted to do, I could just hop on a bus, which was just a few minutes away, and that would take me into Harvard Square. And from there you can, get on the subway and get to any part of the Boston area pretty much. So I do think that was a big part of the interest was, I'm not just being shuttled around every day in a car. It's really easy to kind of space out and not really know where you are. But when you have to navigate it on your own, and understand a bus schedule and all that, I think that leads to, being more curious, I think, about exploring the world around you.
Yeah, I wonder if, because when I think about other cities in the Northeast, sort of older cities throughout the United States, I feel like in some ways, because they were built, or some parts of the towns were built before cars, they were architected differently. And then even as cars were introduced, you still had these constraints because of the way that the places were designed. And so, like a lot of, you mentioned North Carolina, I think even further south there, and as you move out west, things are a little more spread out. So there's a lot more dependency on car travel. But yeah, I think when you don't have to be in a car, it really does sort of open up your world in a sense. You're not boxed in by the vehicle. You can kind of move at your own pace in a way. There's an opportunity to stop and observe things. And so that would certainly create this interest in like understanding the world around you and maps and that sort of thing. So I can imagine where that comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's really one of the maybe underappreciated downsides of the car culture and auto dependency that we have here in the United States, is that loss of connection, I think, to the environment, to the world around you, that it just gets so shut off, I think, when you're viewing everything through a windshield, and being actually out in the elements, and whether that's not always pleasant, especially in the Boston area. You can get some pretty nasty weather, but it's
builds
great
character.
Yeah, well, and it's just nice to be able to experience that. That's just part of being human, I think, and we're shutting more and more of that out, I think, the way that we live. So it was great that I was able to, had the fortune of growing up in a place where I could do that, and where it made sense to do that, right? Where a lot of times it was faster to be able to walk or bike somewhere or take the subway than it was to drive. And so there's also just the convenience factor as well.
Yeah, and there's a certain amount of curiosity that you have as a kid that already inspires this sense of adventure. And so when that is amplified by the ability to walk places, to take the bus, I think about, for me, growing up here in Durham, I've been here most of my life, and I still don't really know street names all that well. I know the major ones, but I can get you pretty much anywhere based on landmarks, based on other sort of things that I remember from the environment, murals that are up on a wall, or particular, trees, or just things like that from walking, biking, even taking the bus to some extent. Because you're not driving, you can kind of be a little bit more observant out the window, but particularly walking and biking, it gives you this, it roots you a bit more in the place that you are. And I do worry that maybe it's like one of those things that's being chipped away by everyone using Google Maps every day. Right. Because you never get lost, you also, there's something there, I think, when you have to really pay attention to where you're going.
Yeah, I was actually telling my kids the other day about a trip. I went to Europe, several different countries in Europe after grad school, and one of the places I went was Venice, which is, of course, just this incredibly beautiful place. And this was before I had a smartphone. So I just would go out every day and get lost. And it's a it's a really easy city to get lost in, because a lot of times you run into these dead ends at the canals. There are obviously some bridges and things that you can go over, but a lot of times I would just turn down this pathway, just getting lost, and all of a sudden I just end up at the water and I have to turn around and go back. And that experience today, I think most people would just pull out their phone and pull out a map, and obviously it's a great tool, but I think people lose that. Getting lost can be it can be scary in certain situations, of course, but in a lot of circumstances it can really be kind of liberating, and you end up seeing things that you might not have seen otherwise.
Yeah, and it also, I think about the, again, connection to your environment. If you do happen to get lost, before smartphones, the thing you would do is just go ask somebody.
Right.
You'd say, hey, I'm trying to find such and such place, and that might connect you to somebody, if you are traveling, somebody in the local town that, has other things to offer. And it just, it roots you in that sense of place. And so I think that, I don't want to, I'm definitely not a Luddite. I enjoy technology, but I think that there are ways that it slowly sort of chips away at our humanity and our community. And I think that, that as convenient as Google Maps can be, I think it also strips away at that a little bit.
Yeah.
So you, as interested as you were in maps and traveling, did it become a potential career path for you? Did you think about this as like, this is something that I would love to continue building on throughout my life, or did other interests move you away from that?
Yeah, it did eventually, but I think I resisted it a little bit at first, because it felt like a childish pursuit for me. When it's something that you're really passionate about as a 5-year-old, right? That becomes something that you kind of think, okay, that's something I did as a kid, but now I need to grow up and get a job and do all that. And I think that was a little bit of a barrier for me. I was thinking, that's like playing with Matchbox cars or something, right? It's not something that you do as an adult. So there were occasional times when I thought, it'd be great to write for Lonely Planet, the travel guides, or I remember having one interview for a job. I really wasn't qualified for it, but it was to go to, I think it was a bunch of countries in West Africa. I spoke enough French that I could probably get by, and the job was about, I think it was determining different prices of things and costs of living for companies that were sending workers overseas and things like that. So there was a few opportunities along the way that I think related to that, but for the most part, I didn't really pursue it until after undergrad, just because, like I said, it felt childish to me. Like, this is not something that a 20-something-year-old should be doing, and it's a weird barrier to have kind of put on myself, and I kind of wish I hadn't put that on myself. It's not like anyone else was telling me that, oh, you can't do that. Maps are for 3-year-olds, right? That's sort of a strange concept, but
it does happen to a lot of us, though.
Yeah.
I think that even if there wasn't one person in particular that put that pressure on you, I think as we get older, we start to think about, okay, what jobs make the most money, what jobs are the most glamorous, and they dilute or they sort of get in the way of our passions in a sense. And it's not like now where you can grow up as a 5-year-old playing video games and actually make a living playing video games, which is like, I missed my chance by like a decade. I was a pretty hardcore gamer back in the day.
Yeah. Well, if anyone, if you can make money playing Pac-Man, I might actually be, maybe that could be my next career.
So you mentioned that you strayed away from sort of maps and travel as a career. What ended up taking its place as you were going into undergrad?
Well, there wasn't anything really in particular. So I went to undergrad at a very small school in Indiana called Earlham College. It's a little Quaker school. Some people are familiar with it in North Carolina because Guilford College, which is in Greensboro, is a very similar school. I think they have similar origins. But I didn't go into school really having any particular idea of what I wanted to major in or what I wanted to do after school. And that didn't really change while I was in school. I mean, it was a small liberal arts school. I took a lot of different types of courses in French and sociology and music. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. I had an absolutely amazing experience. Loved every minute of it. But I still didn't have a good sense coming out of what I wanted to do. And so, I worked for a couple years back in Boston, again, at Berklee College of Music. I did minor in music, so that was an interest, but it was more of just sort of an office job. It didn't really, wasn't really going to lead anywhere in particular. I did teach tennis a little bit in the summers for this program called Tenacity that offered free tennis camps to
that's a great name,
to kids in Boston. It's solid. So and I played tennis in high school and college. So I was still pursuing things I was interested in, but definitely nothing that was leading kind of more towards a career. And it was really once I got to Chapel Hill, I was working for the UNC School of Law, and as a staff person there, you can take courses for free at UNC, which is a really nice benefit. And I think at that point, I was thinking about, what interests me the most, right? If I could just take any course here, what would it be? And I guess I allowed myself to go back to thinking about geography and maps. So I took a couple of geography courses, and one thing kind of led to another, and I came upon urban planning as a something that was something that I could potentially pursue, and looked into the program, and it seemed like a really good fit.
Yeah, you mentioned not really having something that replaced maps and traveling as a major passion and potential career path. And I wonder if that sense of adventure and exploration, you were exposed to so many things that finding any one particular thing was difficult to nail down. Because I think about that for myself sometimes, that I had all these interests as a kid, similarly, like spent a lot of time just sort of walking, exploring. And so it was never really clear what it was that I felt really attached to. I don't know if you can just speak to that at all, if that feels like maybe one of the reasons that you weren't able to or didn't find something to latch on to.
Yeah, I think, part of it is not knowing what some of those opportunities are, right? I didn't know before starting the program at UNC. I ended up getting a master's degree in city and regional planning at UNC. I didn't knew hardly anything about urban planning or transportation planning or what was possible there. So
it's not like many urban planners are showing up to career day at your
exactly.
At your
I mean,
local
I don't remember any of my friends, their parents weren't urban planners, and maybe a couple of them were now, if I look back on it, but I don't remember that. And so I think part of it is just not having a sense of what was possible necessarily. And then again, having this maybe resistance because of feeling like it was a childish pursuit, may have contributed to that. And, part of it is I just think I was in my early 20s and was a little aimless and trying to figure life out. And I think that's a pretty natural thing. And but once it did, once I came across particularly transportation planning in particular, I mean, it was like a switch. I mean, it's just, I couldn't believe how much it fit, sort of what I was interested in and how my brain worked. And, to this day, even if I never get another job in transportation planning, I feel like I'll always sort of be a transportation planner. It's just the way that my mind works. I can't shut it off if I wanted to.
When did you finish at UNC?
So I graduated there in 2007. So it was about 15 years ago. Yeah.
I'm asking because I am thinking about the region that we live in and when some of the big changes started to happen. And I imagine being in urban planning right at the tail end of the 2000s, there was a lot of potential for Durham, for Raleigh, for Chapel Hill. And so there must have been a decent amount of demand for urban planning and thinking about how this region was going to grow. I want to take a quick break and then talk a little bit more about what you stepped into coming out of the master's program. All right, so coming out of this program at UNC, you get your master's degree in urban planning. What kind of career opportunities are you looking for once you finish that program? Is there a particular interest that you're pursuing? Is there a particular place that you're interested in living because of its development potential, or thinking about how the area is structured? Is there anything that's pulling you once you finish that program?
I think my main interest at that time and still today is one of the big ones is in public transportation. It was a field that I knew that there were some jobs available in, and so that is helpful as well when with things like walking and cycling advocacy or work. The opportunities, there are some out there, but they're a little more limited, and you have to kind of find them and seek them out, whereas transit agencies are all across the country. Everyone kind of knows who they are, what they are. And so that was one thing that I think drew me. In terms of where to live, that was a big question at the time. I mentioned earlier that I did this 9-week trip to Europe after grad school, and someone that I had worked with, I ended up working with for many, many years. His name is Patrick McDonough at Go Triangle. He was actually sort of like the client for a transportation workshop that we did at UNC. And so I had met him when I was still in school, and he was moving to a different position at Go Triangle and, let me know. I mean, kind of encouraged me to apply for his old position. But then I, went away for 9 weeks. I thought, well, okay, that job's going to be filled when I get back. But it was still available, and I think for me, I was initially wanting to go to maybe a larger region, places that have subways and light rail and things like that. But I had always been really, I guess, fascinated by Durham. I was living in Chapel Hill at the time, but I was spending more and more time in Durham. And I kind of made a deal with myself that, if that job opportunity worked out here in this region, I really wanted to move to Durham and kind of get more involved in things in Durham. And so when I was offered the job, I think I had sort of made peace with the idea of moving to somewhere bigger that already had, a more robust transit system. And I started getting more into the idea of of working in a region where there wasn't a whole lot of public transportation or people necessarily walking and biking to work or to shopping or to their friends' houses. It's a place where, a small change can actually make a pretty big difference. Whereas, a small change in New York City kind of gets buried under the weight of the whole system. So that ended up being really enticing for me.
So you ended up taking the position after all at Go Triangle.
Yeah.
When you started there, I guess this is around 2007, 2008, what was Durham's transit system like? Had they made the switch? Because I whenever I think of Durham busing, I still have the data bus imagery imprinted in my brain because I took the bus a lot when I went to Durham Tech for a few years. I would either ride my bike to the bus stops and put my bike on the rack or just do the bus the whole way. But I spent a lot of time on the data buses. So when did that switch happen, if you can remember?
Yeah, well, there were a couple different things that happened. When I first started working for Go Triangle, it was actually called Triangle Transit Authority, or TTA. It then changed its name pretty soon thereafter to Triangle Transit, and then later became Go Triangle. So I went through two different name changes just while I was there. And when Tom Bonfield, who was the former city manager, longtime city manager here in Durham, who just recently retired, he when he first got here, he I think looked at the landscape and saw that there was this regional transit agency that had a lot of planning staff and support staff, and realized that there would be some efficiencies in having again, TTA at the time, or Go Triangle now, start to manage the system, the Durham's local system. So they are still two different systems, the regional system and the local system. But they are, the planning of the bus systems are both managed by Go Triangle now. And then the name switch from Data to Go Durham happened, a few years after that. That took place. So now it's Go Raleigh, Go Cary. There was just this sort of Go family of services.
I didn't know Cary had their own set of buses.
They do, yeah.
I don't know
Go
how
Cary.
I feel about that.
Used to be called C-Tran, if I remember, or Cary Transit, and then now everything's the Go brand.
Is there around that time, was there a sense that people, because, I imagine that even back then people were commuting, living in Durham, commuting to Chapel Hill, living in Durham, commuting to Raleigh, and vice versa, any combination of that. Was there a sense that particular trend was moving upwards, and so having a central system in place, sort of getting ahead of that trend? Were you seeing that more people were looking at public transit for those cross-city, their cross-city transportation needs?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fastest growing services by far when I first started were the express buses between the three cities. So there were express buses from Durham to Raleigh, from Chapel Hill to Raleigh, and then there was a pretty decent amount of service along sort of the 15501 corridor between Durham and Chapel Hill, and those were the three that really just took off. The recession hit starting in 2008, 2009, and gas prices went way up, and so there was a huge spike in transit ridership, both local systems but also the regional system, and almost all of that was occurring on those more express style trips between the cities, but also in the middle of the day we were seeing a huge spike in ridership as well.
Yeah, I know all about the Robertson Scholarship Bus from Duke to Chapel Hill. I spent quite a bit of time. I was never a student at UNC, but a lot of my, we'll say, extracurricular activities when I was at Durham Tech, because they didn't have, they don't have dorms, they don't really have nightlife, so to speak. And so I went out to Chapel Hill a lot of weekends and hung out with some friends there. And it was great. I could hop on the Robertson bus Thursday night. I'd pack an overnight bag basically and get on the bus and head to the planetarium at UNC and spend the weekend and take the bus back to be back in Durham in time for work on Sunday. So
yeah, I remember at one point we looked at ridership kind of by day of the week, by time of day. And I'm not sure if this is the case anymore, but at one point the bus between Chapel Hill and Raleigh, the highest ridership would be on Friday afternoons and then Monday mornings. And the thought, and we actually, could see this somewhat, that sometimes it was students going back and forth who either were taking classes at one place or the other, but still living, they might be living in Raleigh, but taking classes at UNC, or they were, staying with boyfriends or girlfriends or whatever kind of over the weekend and then coming back on Mondays. It's just a funny trend to see.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure the Robertson bus was free. I don't know if you technically had to be a student to ride it, but it was a very nice amenity. I don't know that it's a free bus anymore, but yeah, grateful to the transit system for for those good times.
Yeah.
So you are at Go Triangle thinking about approaching transit more regionally, adopting these local transit systems to kind of build out a broader transit map that includes not only the cities themselves, but traveling across cities as well. While this is happening, obviously the region is changing pretty dramatically. This is sort of the the first wave, I guess, of growth, particularly in downtown Durham, but RTP is starting to change. Downtown Raleigh's also starting to grow quite a bit. So how are you all able to, or how are you approaching, I guess, the current needs of the system while also trying to get ahead of all these different aspects of the region that would certainly affect transit and transportation?
Yeah, and it was a fine line, right? Because I think the politics of transit or just getting around the region, you're always hearing about, we need to focus on the next big thing, and that's understandable, right? That's something that of course regions need to kind of get ahead of their travel needs, and in a fast-growing region, that's something that has to be considered. But there were already so many people riding, and particularly in Durham, the local bus system carries far more people every day than the entire regional system, across all three counties. And that's true in Chapel Hill and Raleigh as well. With the local ridership of those systems is much higher than Go Triangle on a daily basis. And so, we also wanted to make sure that we were really concentrating on the needs of people who are already, in some cases relying on transit to get to jobs, to get to grocery stores or whatever their daily needs. So, the thing that I think in a lot of ways I'm most proud of in my career, especially early on when we were starting to manage the Go Durham system, was addressing a lot of the on-time performance issues that the system had. When we first started managing Go Durham, the buses were running on time only about 60% of the time, which is a very, very low number, right? I mean, this is, it really meant that you just couldn't count on the system to get you where you needed to go, when you needed to be there. You missed connections to other buses, and it was in fairly bad shape just in terms of the reliability. And I think a lot of that was because the city was growing, and so the bus lines needed to go further and further out to serve job centers and residential areas. But there hadn't been kind of a recalibration of the system to look at, well, at a certain point, once you just add more time to a route, you can't accommodate that. It's going to be running late. So you have to take a more holistic look. And that's what we did sort of in the 2012, 2013 timeframe.
And I imagine traffic is increasing as well. So it's not only that buses are going further out, but they're also having to deal with more cars on the road, more traffic in between those different stops. And the people that are taking the bus are, to your point, relying on the bus. They don't necessarily have alternatives. And so it is super important that the bus is running on time. It is interesting. We talked a little bit about this before recording, that unlike some of the bigger cities where you have a mix of income levels, of backgrounds, professions, that sort of thing, taking public transit, in Durham, it does feel like there is a divide between, or a correlation, I should say, between sort of income level and who is taking the public transit here. And so I wonder, how are you all thinking about not just the efficiency of the rides, but the riders themselves, and like how are we sort of approaching helping that particular demographic?
One thing that we really concentrated on, in addition to making the system more reliable, and after we made some initial changes, it was up to 85% on time, and so that was a big improvement. But was also looking at shortening how long people were needing to ride the bus, because one of the big discrepancies in terms of someone who is driving in this region and someone who takes the bus is that it's just usually for most trips it takes so much longer to ride the bus, and so but there's a difficult trade-off there, because access and speed of a bus route are kind of diametrically opposed, right? The faster you make a route, the less access that people have to it, because you're staying on the main roads, you're not kind of ducking in and out of neighborhoods. And so that was a big tension when we were making large changes to the system. Not only did we need to cut time out of the routes to make them on time, but we also wanted to make them more direct so that people could get to where they needed to go a lot faster. But again, that's difficult, because now you're changing where the bus stops for people. And when you talk to people who ride Go Durham, they talk about bus stops like they're their stops, right? This is my stop. And so taking that stop away or moving it over even just a block, it is a difficult thing for a lot of people. And we had to be very mindful of that, especially people who have trouble walking to stops. That was a big change, but the system had just kind of gotten unwieldy, unfortunately, and we had to make some changes in order to get it to be reliable and to get people where they need to go on time, because if it takes you 2 hours to get to your job and 2 hours to get back every day, I mean, just think about all the other things that you're missing, the time that you're missing with your kids or with your friends and family. It really limits opportunities, and that's an important thing to think about as well.
Yeah, I've noticed more recently, I haven't been on the bus nearly as much as I used to, but just seeing them buzzing around, I've noticed more sort of variations of routes that I remember taking. So for instance, like the 3 was a route that I would take a lot to get, I guess it came into town from the Village, Holloway Street, Miami Boulevard area. And now there's like a 3A, a 3B, same thing with some other stops. So your point about introducing more routes, it's even though I haven't been on the bus, I can see that how that change has happened. Has that been particularly effective? Do you feel like that through that adjustment period, although there might have been some tension there, do you feel like overall it has brought more easeability to the system as a whole?
Yeah, I think as a whole it has. There are definitely still trade-offs, particularly with the legibility of the system, right? When you're talking about a time when there really weren't a lot of route patterns. There was just Route 3, there was just Route 5, there was just Route 10. And now, we did introduce some different patterns and these sort of A/B patterns that allow you to serve more parts of Durham and do it on time and do it reliably. But it does make the system more complicated and a little bit harder for people to navigate, especially at first. So that can be a trade-off. But I think overall what we saw was not only we're seeing improvements in terms of overall ridership and the on-time performance, but most importantly, every year we did a customer satisfaction survey, on board the buses, and we got to, thousands of riders using the survey. So it was a pretty big sample size, and saw some really major improvements in how people rated the system overall. And so that to me is the ultimate, kind of test of whether you're doing something well or not is what are the people who are using it, what do they think of it? And we consistently saw those scores improve over the years as the system again became more reliable and got people to where they needed to go a little bit faster.
Thinking about how the sort of region operates within the bigger sort of statewide political arena, I guess, how much tension did you all come up against in terms of dealing with the state, whether it be funding or, the having to sort of differentiate between city and state-owned roads? Like, was there any sort of conflict there with dealing with the state legislature that, in North Carolina historically has not been as progressive towards things like alternative transit?
Yeah, I mean, dealing with the state legislature here in North Carolina is always a challenge when it comes to something like public transportation. It's just not, obviously there are several legislators for whom that's they're passionate about it. They want it to see improved, but those tend to be the legislators in places like Durham and Charlotte and Greensboro, and they don't make up the majority of the legislature. I think early on when I was working at Go Triangle, it wasn't as much of a barrier. The Durham, Wake County, and Orange County all were able to put a 50-cent sales tax on a referendum, and held those referenda, and those were all successful back in. So Durham's was in 2011, was the first one. They were the first county to approve that sales tax, and we had to get permission from the legislature to even put that on the ballot. So the fact that they were sort of open to that at the time was good. They were helping to fund Charlotte's Blue Line, which is the light rail line in Charlotte, both the original one and an extension that opened a few years ago. That got, I think 25% of the funding came from the state. And so there was real money that was going towards public transportation in North Carolina. But, in the last few years, or even maybe several years, I think there's been a real shift as it moved more towards a Republican supermajority. All of a sudden, any sort of transit project just seemed to get bogged down in the politics.
I feel like this is where I'm supposed to mention our own complicated history with light rail,
Yeah.
which is a whole podcast, probably to itself, or a book or a documentary. I don't know. There's so many layers to that story.
Maybe
but
all three. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, it does seem like that is one of the tension points with any liberal city or liberal region in a mostly red state, is that there's only so far that you can take certain initiatives, and public transit, I think, for a lot of progressive areas is an important initiative, and so it's hard to see certain things all the way through if you're butting up against folks who just don't see it as a priority. Something that I asked you about, that I would love to hear you talk more about, and this sort of connects to some of the work that you're doing now. Again, thinking about Durham being a very liberal town, and most folks here are very pro taking on climate change. They're very pro economic equality, sort of all those check boxes. But you actually don't see a lot of folks, again, sort of in certain demographics, taking the bus to work or downtown or whatever every day. And one of the things that you mentioned to me was that it's actually more important to keep the system steady for the folks who are riding it, and not necessarily try to appease, the us well-to-dos into taking the bus or changing their habits necessarily. That it's more important to keep the system up and running for those who are taking it. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and I would even take it even a step above just keeping it steady, is really making it an excellent system for everybody, but in particular those who are currently riding transit in Durham or in the region. I think when I first started at Go Triangle, I kind of had the mindset that I think a lot of people still have in Durham, which is, we need to attract these sort of whiter, wealthier riders to the system. That's going to grow ridership, and then that's going to grow support for improving the system overall. And it's sort of an enticing notion, and in some ways it feels like it makes sense. But what I've realized over the years is that, that's kind of like Reaganomics, right? That's sort of like this trickle down idea that if we make the system great for the rich, right, that then the rich will be able to support the poor or something, right? That's a notion that I think is incredibly flawed, and that's kind of what you're saying when if you're just trying to improve the system for people who aren't currently riding. And I think it can lead to some really negative outcomes, because you're going to design a system that sort of meets those people's needs, but those needs are not, oftentimes are not the same as the needs of people who are relying on transit every day. And so you end up just putting so much time and effort and money into projects that almost solely benefit those who are wealthier or whiter. And you don't, I think you wouldn't really see those benefits accruing to people who are currently riding the system. So in my mind, it really needs to be reversed, that thinking, into making it an excellent system for those who are already riding, because they're the ones who need the service the most and who deserve to have a great system, and who are suffering the harms of our transportation system that prioritizes people driving. And if you can't afford to own or maintain a car, or you can't drive because of a disability or something else, you're sort of at the mercy of a transit system that still has bus stops and ditches and, still only runs hourly in the evenings or on Sundays for a lot of routes. So my mind frame has switched on this to thinking we need to make it an excellent system for those who are riding today. And, yes, it would be great to attract more people to ride transit, but that is going to happen if the system is already excellent, and it's going to require other changes to the region, making it denser, making parking more scarce and pricier. I know that's not necessarily a popular opinion, but why do people ride transit in Boston or New York or Philadelphia? It's because they can get to a lot of places fairly easily because the systems are good. They run frequently. They get people to where they want to go. And because it's a whole lot cheaper, right, than owning and maintaining a car and having to pay for parking in a downtown area.
Yeah, there is a I do wonder if New Yorkers think that their system is working. I mean,
no one actually thinks their own system's working well, but I'm thinking more relative to a place where, if you only have hourly bus service, that's quite a bit lower than having a subway that runs every few minutes.
I wonder if there is with car ownership, it to me is tied to this American dream ideal that we have about being, being a successful American citizen, owning a house, driving your own car, sort of having this individualism and autonomy. I guess I don't know if I have a question there, but just am thinking if that gets in the way of certain people's perception or ability to think about public transit as a real alternative to the habits that they've built while driving a car, because you can't, the people don't, you can't trick out your local bus in the way that you could put, cool lights or a nice speaker system in your Mercedes Benz. So, I think there's just a culture. It really is a car culture. I mean, if you watch, I did not watch the Super Bowl, but for people who did, what are like half the ads are these car ads, right? And they show these cars like zipping through either a downtown area with no other cars on the road, which is just unrealistic, or they're going over mountain areas and down these dirt roads like that's something that people do every day. In their $80,000 sports car.
Right, in their sports car or their giant SUV or these huge pickup trucks that are just ridiculous and they're now showing are very dangerous for people walking and in a city. These cars have gotten so big that it's contributing towards more pedestrian deaths every year. But people keep buying them and they're spending a lot of money. These trucks are in the $70,000, $80,000 range now. They're spending a lot of their income on it because that's what's being sold to them as this American dream. And we've built our regions and our cities so that it is, for most people, I don't know if I want to say the word necessary, but pretty close to necessary to own a vehicle and have to drive. I think about my own, my family's situation. We own a car. We do walk and bike and take transit a lot, but there are so many opportunities that would be either shut off or just really, really difficult if we didn't own a car. I think about like my, son plays Little League baseball, and the fields are kind of out on, for those who are familiar with this area, sort of Cheek Road, Junction Road, like kind of on the outskirts of the city, very much so. And to get there, there's no bus out there. It's a 2-lane country road, Cheek Road, 45 miles an hour, right? There's no way I'm biking on there with my 9-year-old son. So, if he wanted to play Little League Baseball and we didn't own a car, you either have to depend on rides from a friend every single time, taking an Uber or Lyft, right? That gets expensive and it's not the easiest thing to try to schedule every day. Just those type of opportunities just would be so much harder to take advantage of if we didn't own an automobile. And that's pretty sad, because we know that there are a lot of people in Durham who aren't able to take advantage of those opportunities because they can't afford or are unable to drive.
Yeah. Yeah, it would really, I think, transform the city to start to rethink. You mentioned something like restricting parking. Like I do remember when, having worked downtown for quite a while, when paid street parking became a thing, and it was like, oh, this is doomsday,
right?
And I was definitely part of that chorus of people that thought, even though I didn't even really. I guess I drive a little bit, but just it felt like, oh, here we go, another way that Durham is becoming more expensive. But I didn't have the perspective to think about how it would actually make people's lives easier or safer, rather, in terms of walkability, bikeability, that sort of thing. So, it's good to have that perspective, and I love. I know for the last couple of years, since leaving Go Triangle, one of the projects that you have been spearheading is the Transit Equity Campaign, which speaks to a lot of what we've already talked about today. So I'd love to give you some time to talk about that campaign and why it's important to you.
Yeah, so this campaign was really born out of a desire to really kind of increase the amount of advocacy that was happening around the Durham Transit Plan in particular. So you briefly mentioned light rail, and I agree that can be a whole other topic. But when that project ended in 2019, actually it's almost exactly 3 years ago now, there's still a lot of money coming in through this Durham, this transit tax that the voters approved back in 2011. And a lot of that was being set aside for and actually being spent on the light rail project. You heard about a little bit of that the other night when we were talking with Bike Durham's executive director, John Talmadge. She was the interim project manager at the end of that project. And so once that project ended, now there was all this money that is unencumbered. It doesn't have a home. It doesn't have a project, any projects attached to it. There is some money still being spent on additional bus service and bus stops and things like that, but there was still a lot of other money that needed to find a home, essentially.
Let me go track down my routing number real quick.
Yeah. We'll just have it sent direct deposit to you, but. So the plan needs to be updated in order to say, well, how now are we going to spend that money in Durham County? And so that plan's still in the stages of being updated. And like I said, it's been 3 years. So it looks like it's going to be finalized pretty soon. But, there's really always these sort of three legs of kind of getting things done in a city, which is you've got the staff who are working on it, right? The transit staff. You've got the elected officials who get to approve the plans and sort of help shape the plans. But you have, maybe the biggest leg of that triangle is the public, and they're I think for a lot of different reasons, which we probably don't have time to get into, there's not been a very consistent and strong advocacy scene around transit in Durham. So I think we saw the need for that and started, Bike Durham started this transit equity campaign started partnering with other organizations, including ones like the Durham Committee on the Affairs of Black People and People's Alliance, some political organizations, to really put racial equity in particular at the forefront of that effort. That equity, I think, has been important to the staff and the elected officials, but hasn't necessarily been codified as the number one priority in the plan update.
Yeah, and there are ways that prioritizing that really helps clarify certain decisions about where money's spent, what projects are greenlit, and which ones aren't. Something that I know we've talked about at Bike Durham is thinking about, and then this was really interesting to me because I think I had been of the, as an avid bike rider, I had been of the mind that it would be great to, put bike lanes in every neighborhood and get, people who don't normally ride their bikes, get them a bike and start to introduce them to that lifestyle, I guess. And some of the things that we're beginning to understand that it sounds like you are quite familiar with through your time with Go Triangle, now with the Transit Equity Campaign, is that, people aren't really thinking about bike lanes if they don't have sidewalks. If their kids can't safely walk to school every day, they don't give a shit about bike lanes. Even if they think that they might one day be interested in biking, it's not a priority for them. And it can't be that goes to your point about trickle down. And it is a very, almost colonizing mentality to come in and say, hey, yeah, we're going to, we like doing this thing. We're sure you're going to like it. So let's put these bike lanes in. And, that has its own ripple effects in terms of changing the sort of who's interested in a neighborhood and, the rising cost of living in certain areas. And so I think it's the right thing to do and also the smart thing to do to sort of put racial equity at the forefront of any work, but particularly transit, where in Durham it is, mostly used by our non-white communities. And so it's a great campaign. Where can people, if they want to get involved, I'm happy to send out links and everything, but if someone wanted to plug in,
Mm-hmm.
Where can they be most effective as a citizen?
Yeah. So I think the two ways, one is to actually, check out the campaign website, actually sign on to the campaign. You can sort of join the campaign, which means that you'll get, messages, not every day or anything like that. This is just an occasional kind of thing. But as there are updates to this transit plan, as the campaign puts out different position papers or other types of information that we think will be helpful to people, that will get to you. And so that is at Bike Durham's website. It's bikedurham.org /transit is where you can find that and sign on to the campaign. And then, the other way is to actually get updates more directly from the transit plan update. That's happening right now, as I mentioned, and there's ways to sign up directly for updates on their website. And I don't have that URL handy, but it's certainly, you can link to it from the Bike Durham site. Yeah.
Cool. I think that's, it's super important that folks are getting involved in their local communities in ways that they feel moved or feel passionate. I think that's, especially coming out of the pandemic, we almost got through the whole podcast without mentioning it. I think folks are starting to get back out there more, and our communities will, need to be rebuilt in a sense. And so finding sort of campaigns like the Transit Equity Campaign are great ways to plug in and sort of reintroduce yourself to your community. So yeah, I'll definitely send that out in the show notes when this podcast goes out. Thanks so much, Erik, for being on the show. If you're on Twitter, I know there are far less people on Twitter than Erik and I would like to imagine. But Erik does really, he's one of my favorite people to follow on Twitter. He's, again, a wealth of knowledge, quite snarky, which I appreciate.
Yeah, it's a pithy account, that's for sure.
But I do think, if you are going to doom scroll on something, I think learning a little bit more about your local public transit is a great way to spend that time. So definitely follow Erik. It's at Durham Complete on Twitter. Yeah, definitely give him a shout out there. I got one last question for you, and we'll get out of here. Do you have a favorite street in Durham?
Yeah, it's a good question. You kind of sent this to me in advance, so I had a little time to think about it. But I actually didn't want to spend too much time thinking. I just wanted to go with my gut reaction. And I'm going to give two. I'm going to prevaricate and go with two. One is Watts Street, just because that it's very close to where we live. Our kids go to school along Watts Street, and it's just it's one of those. It's a great street to walk or bike on. It's got a lot of street trees. It's beautiful. It's got a mix of housing, which I really like. You've got apartments and some single family and churches, and you just have this great mix of stuff. So Watt Street would be up there for me. So the second street is actually Fayetteville Street. And it's actually for kind of similar reasons to Watts. A very different type of street, much more of a main street, has a lot more traffic, a lot of bus service, 15-minute bus service on there. But again, it's just the mix of uses along it. Just you get commercial areas, residential. We've got North Carolina Central, the old Hayti neighborhood. And so you really just get this kind of whole slice of Durham. I feel like if you go down Fayetteville Street, and then you get into sort of South Pointy land and all that in southern parts of Durham, you're gonna see a lot of Durham just by going down that street. And so I find that that's something I love about it is it's really cool just to be able to go down a whole street and kind of get a sense of a city, and I feel like Fayetteville is kind of the best street to do that in Durham.
Does Fayetteville eventually dead end at South Point? I've never actually taken Fayetteville as far as it can go, because I know it does get you to the streets of South Point. But
well, I suppose it eventually gets you to Fayetteville, right? That's why it was called Fayetteville Street. I think if I were recalling it eventually sort of tees into 751.
Okay.
A little bit south of, closer to Jordan Lake is where it officially ends. But like I said, it's called Fayetteville Street because at one point it must have gone all the way to Fayetteville, right? Roxborough went all the way to Roxborough.
And it becomes, I'm pretty sure it becomes Durham Road once you get into Roxborough.
Well, sure, right. Those roads, right? The Highway 98 used to be called Wake Forest Highway, and you got Chapel Hill Road and Hillsborough Road, right? These are all ones that ended in those towns or in those cities. Those were the roads to get there, and so at one point Fayetteville must have gone all the way to Fayetteville.
Yeah, that's quite a hike.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again, Erik, for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I do enjoy getting to spend time with one another doing Bike Durham stuff. We definitely got to get on the basketball court at some point soon.
Yep.
I'm not sure who your current comp would be, but I'll report back for folks once Erik and I get a couple games in. We'll figure out if he's more of a Luka Doncic, a Jokic, maybe he's LeBron. Who knows? I've never seen him play, so we'll see. But thanks everyone for listening, and we'll be back soon. It's good to be back at the podcast desk.